What if the United States military had a detailed, step-by-step plan to occupy American cities, suspend civilian authority, and deploy combat troops against its own citizens? And what if that plan wasn't a theory, but a fully documented Department of Defense operation that's been updated and maintained for over 50 years? The documents are real, they've been declassified, and what they describe will fundamentally change how you understand the relationship between the Pentagon and the streets you walk every day. In 1968, in the aftermath of the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, and amid widespread urban unrest across dozens of American cities, the United States Army quietly formalized a plan it called Operation Garden Plot. The Civil Disturbance Plan was codified under Department of the Army Civil Disturbance Plan 55-2, and it laid out a comprehensive framework for the deployment of federal military forces within the borders of the United States during periods of domestic crisis. This wasn't a vague contingency memo. It was a fully operational directive, complete with command structures, rules of engagement, logistics chains, and designated staging areas for troops in every region of the country. For decades, the plan was classified, known only to senior military and civilian defense officials. But through a combination of Freedom of Information Act requests, congressional inquiries, and investigative journalism, key portions of this martial law plan were eventually declassified, and what they revealed was staggering in both scope and specificity. The declassified Pentagon documents associated with Operation Garden Plot describe a tiered response system in which the Department of Defense can assume increasing levels of control over civilian areas when civil authorities are deemed unable to maintain order. Under the plan, the Secretary of the Army serves as the executive agent for military domestic operations related to civil disturbance, coordinating across all branches of the armed forces. The documents specify the creation of task forces assigned to each of the Army's continental commands, with pre-designated units trained and ready for rapid deployment to American cities. Rules of engagement within the plan include provisions for the use of lethal force, mass detention of civilians, the establishment of military checkpoints, and the imposition of curfews, essentially the architecture of martial law without ever using that exact phrase. Perhaps most unsettling, the plan explicitly addresses the coordination between military intelligence units and civilian law enforcement for the surveillance and monitoring of protest movements, political organizations, and individuals deemed potential threats to civil order, a provision that would later become the center of a massive domestic spying scandal. Operation Garden Plot was never just a plan on paper. It was activated multiple times. In April 1968, following the assassination of Dr. King, over 58,000 National Guard and federal troops were deployed to cities including Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and Chicago under Garden Plot directives, marking one of the largest military domestic operations since the Civil War. In 1971, elements of the plan were activated during the May Day protests in Washington, when over 12,000 people were arrested in a single day, the largest mass arrest in American history, with military units providing logistical support and detention infrastructure. The plan was reportedly placed on standby during the 1992 Los Angeles riots following the Rodney King verdict, when nearly 4,000 federal troops and Marines were ultimately deployed to south-central Los Angeles. Each activation followed the same blueprint outlined in the original Civil Disturbance Plan. Civilian authorities request federal assistance. The Secretary of Defense authorizes deployment, and military commanders assume operational control of designated zones. But here's what makes Garden Plot different from ordinary disaster response. The plan was specifically designed not for natural disasters, but for the suppression of the American population itself. In 1971, a former Army intelligence officer named Christopher Pyle published a bombshell expose in Washington Monthly revealing that the U.S. Army had been conducting a massive covert surveillance program against American civilians, and that this program was directly connected to the intelligence-gathering provisions within Operation Garden Plot. Pyle disclosed that Army intelligence had compiled dossiers on over 100,000 American citizens, including civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, journalists, clergy members, and even members of Congress. The program, known internally as CONUS Intel, short for Continental United States Intelligence, used undercover agents who infiltrated political organizations, attended protest rallies, and filed detailed reports that were stored in a centralized database at Fort Holabird in Maryland. Senate hearings led by Sam Ervin in 1971 confirmed the scope of the surveillance and led to public outrage. But critically, the underlying operational framework of Garden Plot was never dismantled. The surveillance provisions were ostensibly reformed, but the civil disturbance plan itself continued to be updated, revised, and maintained by the Department of Defense through subsequent decades, which raises an obvious and deeply uncomfortable question about what version of this plan exists today. Despite being partially declassified, Operation Garden Plot has never been rescinded. In 2005, it was reportedly folded into a broader Department of Defense framework under NORTHCOM, United States Northern Command, which was established after September 11, 2001, and which, for the first time in American history, gave a single military command authority over all military operations within the continental United States. Subsequent executive directives, including National Security Presidential Directive 51, signed by President George W. Bush in 2007, established protocols for continuity of government operations during catastrophic emergencies, protocols whose full classified annexes have never been released to Congress or the public. In June 2020, during the civil unrest following the death of George Floyd, active-duty military units from the 82nd Airborne Division were staged at bases just outside Washington, D.C., and military helicopters conducted low-altitude passes over civilian protesters, actions that multiple analysts noted were consistent with Garden Plot operational procedures. The Pentagon has never publicly confirmed or denied whether Garden Plot or its successor plans were formally activated during those events. What we know for certain is this: the United States military maintains, to this day, a continuously updated civil disturbance plan that provides a legal and operational framework for the deployment of combat troops against American citizens on American soil, and the full current version of that plan remains classified. Operation Garden Plot forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality about the architecture of American governance. This is not conspiracy theory. These are verified, declassified Pentagon documents that describe, in precise military language, how federal troops would occupy American cities, detain civilians, suppress protests, and operate under rules of engagement that include the authorization of lethal force against U.S. citizens. The plan has been activated before. It has been updated continuously for over 5 decades, and its current iteration remains hidden from public view. Every American, regardless of political affiliation, should be asking the same fundamental question. In a constitutional republic, who authorized the permanent existence of a military blueprint for the domestic occupation of its own country, and who is ensuring that the safeguards against its abuse are actually functioning? The documents exist, the deployments happened, and the plan is still active. The only thing that's ever changed is how much of it they've allowed you to see. If this video opened your eyes, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Because our next investigation digs into another declassified program that reveals just how far the government was willing to go to control what Americans think, say, and believe. You're not going to want to miss it.